In our current culture, it seems like it's become increasingly more important for people to try and individualize themselves, to try to set themselves apart from everyone else around them. You see, there's a struggle to be unique, to stand out from the crowd. And people do this in varying ways. Some people dress in a certain style. Some people cut or color their hair in a certain way. And others set themselves apart with body art or piercing. There are whole people groups who distinguish themselves from the rest of society and humanity by their appearance, or by the way that they dress, or by the way that they live and interact with others. And when you look into Scripture in the Old Testament, when we see God's people, we see that He has always set them apart. He has marked them. In the Old Testament, when He cut covenant with Abraham, God marked Abraham's physical body as a sign of their covenant. And then all of Israel also marked their bodies as a sign of covenant that they served God. And we see this in the New Testament as well. But God takes it one step further than just a physical marking. It says in 1 Peter 1:9 that you are a chosen people, you are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. One translation says it like this: you're a chosen people, you are royal priests, a holy nation, a peculiar people. That word peculiar also means marked. It literally means that God draws a circle around us and He marks us as uniquely His own. It goes on to say that as a result of this peculiar marking, that we should show others the goodness of God, for He called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. The French philosopher Ernest Renan once wrote, "He whom God has touched will always be a being apart. He is, whatever he may do, a stranger among men. He is marked by a sign." In Psalm 4 it says that the Lord has set apart the godly for Himself. And we see in the New Testament the Apostle Paul describes this being set apart in some very stark verbal imagery. In Romans 6, he likens those set apart as slaves to God, no longer being slaves to sin. And in Ephesians 6 he says, "As slaves of Christ, do the will of God with all of your heart." The Apostle Peter also uses the same verbiage in 1 Peter 2, when he tells us that we are free, but we are also God's slaves. In the Old Testament, under the law of Moses, if you were a bond slave and you had worked off your debt, you were free to go. But if you ended up loving your master and you wanted to stay and serve him, the master of the house would take you to the doorway of the house and drive a nail through your ear into the doorpost. This would be a sign to everyone that you were no longer serving out of obligation, but out of choice. And everyone who saw that mark would recognize this. In Romans 12, Paul pleads with us to give your bodies to God because of all He has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind He will find acceptable, because this is truly the way to worship Him. We worship God by not simply coming to a church, but rather we should worship God with every aspect of our lives, spiritual, emotional, and physical. The way that we live our entire lives as a sacrifice to God should be the defining mark to this world that we are Christ's possession. And it should be clear to all who see us that we are God's by the way that we sacrificially love and serve others around us. When you think about your relationship to God, do you see yourself as a sacrificial slave, uniquely marked and set apart to God? Or are you living a life serving yourself?